questions from the podium if you're comfortable. That's probably more comfortable for you all, or not at the podium, but around somewhere, around
Sure.
the podium?
Or do you want to stay seated?
Whatever
do you want to do. What do you want to do?
I'm fine.
Good evening. I was hesitating to break that wonderful warm bubble of conversation and fellowship that just naturally happens when people are gathered in the way that we are, so forgive me for breaking that warm, hospitable bubble of conversation. My name is David King, and it is my privilege, on behalf of Malone students and the entire Malone University community, to welcome you to this evening's Worldview Forum. At Malone, we have what is now nearly a 20-year tradition of Worldview Forum programs. They are timely, they are thoughtful, they are at times provocative, but they are civil, and they are structured as such. Allow me to take a moment to simply read from our website our description of the purpose of Worldview Forum. The intent of the Worldview Forum is to provide the community with the opportunity to practice critical thinking and civil dialogue in the comparison of various worldviews in a professionally moderated academic environment. It is expected that the forums will help those who attend learn to identify the elements of differing worldviews, as well as their implications upon belief and practice. Worldview Forum. As I have thought about this evening's conversation, two things have been kind of rolling around in my mind. So allow me to take a minute to share with you what's rolling around in my mind. First, when thoughtful colleagues at Malone, and there were several of them, thoughtful colleagues at Malone envisioned and launched Worldview Forum 20 years ago, who could have imagined how rare civil dialogue would become? I'm seeing John Geib. Wow, John was one of the founders of Worldview Forum. Welcome. Who could have imagined how rare civil dialogue would become these short 20 years later? Today, more than ever, our Worldview Forum is a model for our students and our community of the kind of civil dialogue that strengthens rather than divides communities. Thank you, Tony and Bart, for the ways you are exemplars of such dialogue, not just this evening, but in the many ways I've known for many, many years. Which brings me a bit to my second thought rolling around in my mind, and that is community. Community. At Malone, we hold as a very high value the way we work and learn together in community. How we engage one another around differences is a very important part of our aspiration for community. Scott Peck, author of, among other books, The Different Drum, Community Making and Peace, says it very well. Scott Peck, just because it is a safe place does not mean community is a place without conflict. It is, however, a place where conflict can be resolved without physical or emotional bloodshed and with wisdom as well as grace. Peck says, a community is a group that can disagree gracefully, or I might paraphrase, a family that can disagree gratefully. Tony and Bart, thank you for your willingness to share your ongoing journey of father and son with us this evening. Thank you for the ways you are journeying together that models for us wisdom and grace and unconditional love, as the differences in your faith journeys have become profound. Our conversation this evening will be moderated by Dr. Jason Moyer. Dr. Moyer serves as Associate Professor of Communication Arts at Malone and as Chair of the Department of Communication, Visual, and Performing Arts. And by way of introduction, I'll also take a moment to introduce our proponents this evening, Tony and Bart. But as I said to our students this morning in community worship when Tony spoke, I'm not going to introduce them as you would normally think. You can do that easily. You can Google Bart or Tony and get to a Wikipedia page that will list the 30-plus books that Tony has written, some in partnership with Bart. You can see the ways in which each of them have in profound ways over their vocational journeys have been about community building. Community building, that's fundamentally who they are. So you can read that. I happen to have the privilege of knowing Bart and Marty and Tony and Peggy. And Peggy, thank you so much for being with us today as well. I've known them well for 25 years. I've known of Tony for 45 years. And so I'd like to just share a couple things of my personal experience by way of introduction. Some of which, and for those of you who may have been here this morning, will be a little bit of a repeat. In college, I was in college in the mid-1970s. It was a long time ago. Like at Malone, the college I attended had required chapel services, 3 times a week required. You can do the math. Over the course of 4 years, how many chapels I may have attended. I attended most of my requirements. Of those 250 plus chapel services, I remember 2 speakers. One was Tony Campolo. And so from that moment on, Tony's thoughtful, challenging, and stimulating ways of taking those of us who have grown up breathing evangelical air all our entire lives and challenging us to think about a deep relationship with Jesus Christ and how to live that out in ways that were meaningful in our society today were challenging me since 45 years ago. Fast forward, and in ways I never would have thought, we became colleagues at Eastern University. And Bart was in that community as well, and so I got to know Bart and Marty as well. And so there are a couple things perhaps that I could share from that series of that number of years. But let me just say maybe 2 or 3 things. One, let me say a word about legacy. Both Bart and Tony already have established legacies. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of ministries around the world that have been spawned as a direct result of Tony's work. Bart has been involved in some of those. And so there's a multi-generational, multinational legacy that these men have spawned. Secondly, in the way of anecdotes, and lastly, in the way of personal anecdotes, I want to share a story that connects Tony in this case, although I think by association Bart as well, with Malone University. 7 years ago this month, Wynne and I visited the Malone University Board of Trustees. As a result of that conversation, the board held a vote and asked us to come and serve at Malone. And we've been here ever since. In the days following that October meeting in 2011, I went back to my office at Eastern University to finish out, hopefully well, those last several weeks. Tony's office at the time was in the same building mine was in. And so we'd see each other occasionally, but not a lot. Several days later, after I was back from Malone, Tony came, and this had been announced at Eastern as well at Malone. Tony came downstairs and popped in my office and said, "David," he said, "I wish you weren't leaving Eastern. But if you're going to go anywhere, I'm so glad you're going to Malone." I had no idea that he would know of Malone, let alone have such an idea about this place. And here's why. He recounted the story that in 1976, when Tony was running for Congress in southeastern Pennsylvania, a busload of Malone students piled into a bus, drove to Philadelphia, and canvassed door to door on Tony's behalf in that campaign. Tony reminded me today as we reconnected on that story that the particular community that they canvassed, Phoenixville, Tony carried 2-1, thanks to Malone students going door to door. I'm deeply privileged and grateful to be at Malone and for the ways in which 20 years at Eastern University, formed in part by Tony, have formed our time here as well. So enough of that and reminiscing. Jason, thank you for your role this evening. Bart and Tony, thank you for being here. Peggy, it's a delight to have you here among our community. Please join me in welcoming Tony and Bart.
Good evening, everyone. Our format tonight is pretty straightforward. The first portion is going to be about a 5-minute section on a deconversion that Bart experienced from Christianity, and then a 5-minute response to that from his father. Following that, I'll ask a question, a pre-planned question to the two of them, and they'll alternate in their responses. So it's pretty straightforward. I'll ask 5 questions. At the end, we'll have an opportunity for audience questions. At that point, what I'd ask you to do is to come forward to the microphones when I ask and to ask a question rather than maybe tell a story. Please. That will allow us to get more questions in. So please, if possible, do that. So first, we'll begin with Bart and the beginning story of a deconversion.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having us here. I love Malone, too. I've been here a few different times. The last time I was here was when David was getting inaugurated and Over the Rhine was playing in this auditorium. And they're probably going to be more exciting than we are. But as we begin, I'm tempted to tell you my life story just because I like to do that. But I'm not going to, because we wrote this book about why I left, why I stayed, which is kind of all about the big arguments and how somebody goes from being an evangelical Christian to having those doubts and those uneasinesses and finally working their way out of Christianity. You've probably heard that story from other people before, and if you haven't, as David said, you could go on the internet and not just find mine, but find hundreds of other people telling a similar story. I think what's important for us to talk about tonight is what happens after that moment. Like, there was a moment in my life when I had just had a bad bicycle crash, and I had a head injury. I went off my bicycle, and I remember leaving in the morning, and I remember waking up in the hospital. And I was badly concussed, and it took me about a month to be able to think straight again. And when I finally recuperated from this head injury, I remember saying to my wife, you know, I've been on this journey for all these years, and I had been slowly becoming more and more liberal, more and more progressive. My evangelical orthodoxy was dying the death of 1,000 cuts. But at the end of that bike crash, when I recovered, I remember saying to my wife, I'm pretty sure that my identity is in my brain. Because if you smash my brain against a tree at 40 miles an hour, I change. I think I'm right here. And I said, I'm also pretty sure I'm going to die because I almost died. And if you've ever had one of those near-death experiences, your mortality becomes very present to you. So I was like, I think I'm right here in my head. I think I'm going to die. And I think that when I die and this brain breaks down, I think that's it. I said, Marty, I think this life is all we get. And she looked at me and she said, I've been thinking that for a long time. She said, I'm thinking you better stop being a professional Christian because there's nothing left for you. You don't believe in a supernatural God. You don't believe in the resurrection. You think this life is all there is. She said, I'm with you on that, but she said, you can't keep being a professional Christian. And that made sense to me, and I knew I was done at that point. But, you know, I think for a lot of people who go through this process, there's that moment. It doesn't all happen at once. There isn't this one moment where you go like, oh, I thought I was fine and now it's over. It goes slow, but there's a moment when you know you're done. And I don't think it was 5 minutes into that thought that it occurred to me, what am I going to tell my parents? You know, I knew I was going to lose my job. I knew I was going to lose my identity. I had thought through some of that stuff, that I was going to have to find a whole new community. I was going to have to figure out a whole new way of pursuing goodness on the other side of faith. I know all that. And that stuff didn't scare me that much. But I was really nervous about talking to my parents. Not because I thought that they would condemn me. Not because I thought that they would be angry at me. but because I knew it would be hard for them. I knew it would be painful for them. And for my dad especially, I knew it would be embarrassing. I mean, my dad's Tony Campolo. He's a big deal in the evangelical world. And for the last 20 years, I had been like, you know, the son you want to have if you're an evangelical Christian. You're like an inner city missionary, a guy who preaches all over the place. Like, I was a good son. And I was really worried. And so there came this Thanksgiving. Gosh, it doesn't seem like that long. It was 2011, so it's like seven or so years ago. There came this Thanksgiving, and folks were coming to the house, and I knew I was going to have to, I knew the time had come where I was going to start having to make personal moves, so I needed to say something. And I can't tell you, I'm not very good at recounting individual conversations, but I know that the thing that was the most important for me to communicate to them was not that I wouldn't believe in God anymore, or that I didn't believe in God anymore, but that I couldn't believe in God anymore. And he said, well, why did you have to phrase it that way? I said, because what I was most worried about was having my parents feel like my decision to leave Christianity was a repudiation of them and the way that they had raised me. There's a sense in which, and in the 7 years since then, now my primary occupation these days is counseling people who have lost their faith in God and are trying to figure out how to work it out in their marriages, or trying to figure out how to work it out in their families. And this is the big thing, is that so often the pain is not as theological as it is personal. It's this feeling that you've left the tribe. You've quit the family. And so I remember saying to my folks, I can't do this anymore. Not I won't. Like, honestly, my life, if I could take a pill and go back to believing in God the way I used to, it would have been very good for me. I had a job, I had a career, I had an identity. I would have loved to have stayed a Christian if I could. I can't do it anymore. And people say to me, well, how did your parents react? And I said, I don't know exactly, because at the moment at which I said, I'm done, my father put his hands head in his face, and I didn't see him for the next 15 minutes. I think you were praying, but it was hard. And so I think as we start this conversation, I just wanted to I feel like as the secular humanist in a room full of probably many Christians, I think it's really important to lead off by saying that there are a lot of people who don't believe in God. And I think the caricature is that they're angry, or that they hate the church, or that they want to tear down Christianity. And I would say that the vast majority of people who have left the church have left it reluctantly and with a lot of love looking over their shoulders. And they really struggle with how to relate to you now, because we don't like the fact that we disappointed you.
Thanks, Tony. Please.
I will always remember that evening when Bart sat with my wife and me and told us that he was no longer a Christian and he no longer believed in God. You have to understand that he had been part of what I had been doing for years. He had worked in missionary programs with me, establishing programs in Philadelphia and in other cities. A co-laborer in the vineyard, a partner in ministry, and to suddenly have him say I wish I could say it was out of a clear blue sky, it wasn't, but to have him say it was like a knife went into my stomach. I felt pain. I knew immediately, being a sociologist and being somebody who knew the Bible a little bit, that intellectual arguments weren't going to work. I'm always intrigued by these people who think they can make Christianity sound reasonable. I mean, the C.S. Lewis thing is wonderful for people who can connect with that. But I have to tell you this, that the first chapter of Corinthians says, to those who don't believe, the gospel is foolishness. I mean, to say that the God who created the universe became a human being, lived among us, was crucified, and in that death, mysteriously and wonderfully absorbed the sins of the world into his own body, was buried, resurrected, ascended into heaven, is coming again. On a logical basis, that doesn't work. I knew that having apologetics was not going to do it with Bart. Immediately after that particular encounter in which he told me that he wasn't a believer anymore, my wife and I sat down and said, what are we going to do now? And one thing she said was, well, we're certainly going to maintain a relationship with him. He's our son. We love him. We're not going to let this important decision end our relationship of father, son, mother, son. We're going to keep loving him. We're going to stay in close relationship with him. About 2 weeks later, I was heading over to the United Kingdom to go on a speaking tour, and I asked Bart to go along with me. And we went to England and traveled all over the place, and we did most of our traveling on trains, and we had long conversations trying to figure out what had gone wrong. Why had he lost his faith? Incidentally, I belong to a little support group. 4 guys that get together with fair regularity and talk about what's going on in our lives and our faith. When I sat down and told these guys what had happened, there was dead silence for a moment. And then they went around, and each of them said, I have a son or I have a daughter who has left the faith. And I realized I was not alone on this. That every one of my friends had somebody who, like Bart, had left the faith. And we realized that we had to set a pattern, and that pattern is, let's keep the conversation going, let's maintain a loving relationship, and let's see where we go from here. I wish I could have said that it came to me out of a clear blue sky. It didn't. I watched what was happening to Bart. He had stopped going to church. Now, I know what you're going to say. You're not telling me that church is crucial, are you? That's exactly what I'm saying. I'm a sociologist, and sociologists say that what people believe is highly determined by who they associate with. And we call this a plausibility structure. A plausibility structure is when you're surrounded with people who believe a certain thing, who think a particular way. It's only a matter of time before you take on their thinking and you take on their believing. Most of you at one time or another have gone away to a church camp. You know, you go there on a Saturday and return the following Saturday, and you know what it's about. You can be a lukewarm Christian when you go to camp. After 6.5 days of singing and listening to Bible studies and being with people who are rah-rah for Christ and the kingdom, by the end of the week, you're on fire for Jesus. I mean, how many kids get transformed in that? And suddenly, the whole Christian faith makes sense to you. The whole story is plausible, and sociologists call this a plausibility structure. Now, I want to say the following. Being a Christian can only be maintained if you belong to a group that is regularly meeting. That's why the scripture says, neglect not the assemblies of yourselves together. You are the body of Christ. No member of the body can say to the rest of the body, I have no need of thee. Every member of the body must be connected with the rest of the body and get the revitalization, the renewal, the regeneration of faith. Faith is a fragile thing. And without that reinforcement that comes from being together with fellow Christians, it's only a matter of time before it ebbs away. And I watched Bart and his family stop going to church And I knew that it would only be a matter of time before they would end up where he did end up, away from God and away from Christ and away from the church. So I do have to say this. I saw it coming because I saw Bart drifting away from that plausibility structure that keeps faith alive. Without a plausibility structure, you die spiritually. I will have to say the opposite. The secular society is also a plausible structure. It seduces people. And I feel that Bart has been seduced by a secular culture. I mean, if you can be seduced into faith at a summer camp in a week, certainly you can be seduced away from Christianity in the secular society.
It's hard to stop Tony Campolo from talking.
Well,
I
wanted to give the invitation and sing Just As I Am.
Well, I appreciate it. Is anyone going into Thanksgiving dinner expecting to make a controversial political or theological move? Well, if you are, you should listen to how these two are talking. Like Dr. King was saying, in the vitriol of our political society right now, it's refreshing to have a dialogue about something that's controversial in love. And so I'll turn it over to you and ask the first question that I have prepared here, that we prepared here. Do you support or have compassion for your son's or father's position? What have you learned from each other in this transition?
Well, for a couple of things. First of all, if you guys don't mind, I'm going to talk a little bit more to him because, like, I sort of feel like dialogue is a good thing. You know, like we want to model dialogue, and if we just give matching speeches, we're not really talking. So I was listening to him, and it was so funny when he was talking about the plausibility structure thing. I was thinking, when it's Christianity, it's a plausibility structure. When it's the secular society, it's seduction.
You got it.
And that's the interesting thing is that your dad's absolutely right, that we're shaped by the people around us, and that it's very difficult to maintain any kind of spiritual commitment or any kind of form of engagement unless you're supported by people around you. You know, Muslim cell groups know that. The Navy SEALs know that. Marching bands know that. That we're groups of, we're social beings, and we're shaped by the people around us. And so when Dad says, like, hey, I think you drifted away from being in that community where evangelical theology made sense, that's true. You say, well, now I'm a humanist chaplain. You say, what does a humanist chaplain do? Do you go on college campuses trying to convince Christians to give up their faith? Oh, no. No. When people are thriving in their faith, I leave them alone. I go on college campuses looking for kids who don't believe in God and who are lonely and discouraged, or who are planning to use their lives in empty and stupid ways, making rich people richer. And I try to build a community of people that are committed to pursuing goodness by building loving relationships and by making the world a better place for other people, especially for needy people. And for cultivating a sense of wonder and gratitude for the privilege of being alive in the first place. It may, whether or not it comes from anyone, life is a gift. And if this life is the only one that we have, it's all the more precious. And so I say to these kids, listen, if you want to make the most of your lives, it's not by making money, it's not by gaining power, it's not by having sex with the most partners or using the most drugs, it's by developing the most loving relationships. I've got lots of scientific data to support this notion that the people that live the longest and register the highest levels of happiness are those who commit themselves to a handful of loving relationships and to work that makes a difference, and who cultivate gratitude. And then I send my kids out on the campus, and I say, bring your lonely friends into this group, and when they get here, love them. We'll play games together. We'll sing songs together. We'll have potluck dinners together. And the kids go, this is brilliant. This is so revolutionary. Where did you get these ideas? And I said, well, the youth group, Young Life, right? The church. And so when Dad says, you know, you need to create a structure in which pursuing goodness in a particular way makes sense, I absolutely agree. You ask, what did I learn? like
you're getting into it very well. Thank you.
That's the main thing that like I learned, and what I would say is that when it comes to, if there's anything that I'm trying to do in my life, most of the secular people that I know, when they leave the church, a lot of times they've been hurt by the theology. They're gay people that have been hurt by the way the church excludes gay people. They're women who have been hurt by the way that the church, in many cases, downgrades women. Not all churches, not all Christians. I'm just saying there are a lot of hurt people out there. You know this. And when those people become secular, a lot of times they're like, I'm never going to church again. I'm not singing any songs. I don't want to be a part of anything organized. I just want to be a good person. And I look at them and I say, good luck with that. Because I don't know anybody that can live up to their ideals if they're not in fellowship. And so what I learn and what I appreciate from my dad's position is that I think he really understands that what you call discipleship and what I call pursuing love as a way of life, it's a team sport. And people that try to undertake it alone don't last very long, and they don't do it very well. That we are a tribal species. And so that's, people say, the church is so tribal. And I go like, I know, that's good. We need more tribes of people that are committed to love as a way of life. Is that good enough?
Yeah, I love it. Thank you. Tony, same question.
And that makes sense to you. You buy that.
Cite the question again.
Sure, absolutely. Do you support or have compassion for your son's position? What have you learned from him in this transition?
Yeah, what have you learned from me?
I learned that there's a big difference between being a believer and being a disciple. Believers are people who accept certain theological postulates as true, as valid. Disciples are people who live out certain teachings of a teacher. In a real sense, Bart is a disciple. I mean, he is committed to working with poor people. I can't read through the New Testament without becoming aware that Jesus has a bias for the poor. His only description of Judgment Day is how we related to the poor. Did you feed the hungry? Did you clothe the naked? Did you take care of the sick? Did you visit the people in prison? Did you receive the alien from another country? Jesus makes caring for the poor the core of what it means to be his disciple. And in this respect, I think Bart has done a good job, even since leaving the Christian faith, of being a disciple. I'm a believer. I'm not sure to what extent I'm a disciple. I'm still striving to be a disciple. Every time I sign a book, I always sign it Philippians 3:13 and 14. Not as though I've already arrived, not as though I've already apprehended, forgetting those things which are behind. I press towards the mark of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. I affirm Bart's honesty. The last thing I would have wanted was him to go on faking that he was a Christian when he wasn't.
And we both know lots of people who do that.
Yeah.
Because they have to.
Yeah. And, you've got to appreciate the honesty of somebody who is going to risk his relationship by being honest. Because it was a risk when you told me that. You didn't believe. So I appreciate his honesty. I affirm his willingness to go on working with poor people, serving people in need. I think this is beautiful. I wish that all humanists were as committed to the work of Jesus as you are. And that's where I think I'll leave it right now.
Go ahead.
I want to add one thing.
We got to go a little quicker maybe to get all of them in. We can leave one out if you all want to, but go ahead.
Yeah, you say, what do I appreciate about my dad's position? And a lot of times when we'll be in, this conversation just keeps going between us, and a lot of times Dad will say, look, I don't know about it, I just know Jesus. And he'll always say, I find in Jesus this, and it's very Jesus focused. He calls himself a red letter Christian because he's only interested in the words that Jesus said. And not only, but that's the high point.
Yeah, that's what you're doing.
Right. Right. And you say, like, what do you like about it? And I say, people always ask me, I say, oh, I love my dad's Jesus. And they say, what do you mean your dad's Jesus? There's just one. And I go like, oh, no. If you get 100 Christians and ask them about Jesus, they'll all tell you a different Jesus. I said, listen, because people are always writing to me and telling me, like, oh, if you would just focus on Jesus and Jesus, just Jesus. And I always think to myself, Jesus, what access does anybody have to Jesus? A bunch of secondhand stories that don't even agree with each other at all the key points. I mean, I always struggle with that. Even as a Christian, I struggle to know, like, what would Jesus do? I was like, I don't know what my mother would do, and I know my mother. But what I found is that when Christians tell me about who Jesus is, I ask them that question all the time, because it doesn't tell me anything about who Jesus is, but it tells me everything about who they are. And so when people say to me, why are you so committed to the poor? Why are you so committed to pastoral care? Why are you so committed to community building? I say, oh, that's because, if I'm honest, I go like, I've been deeply influenced by my father and my mother's Jesus. Which really means I've been deeply influenced by my father and mother, because the Jesus they believe in, I don't know how much it reflects the person who walked around 2,000 years ago, but I know it very clearly reflects who they are. And so one of the things I've really learned from my parents is what to value. And they call it Jesus. And I say, well, you can project anything onto Jesus. They say, well, why do you like your parents' Jesus? And I go, because I like my parents. If that makes sense.
It does.
Yeah.
I want to give you do you want to respond to that, or do you want me to ask the next
Well,
question, just to balance it?
We're at a Quaker school, and George Fox made a statement that really has conditioned my thinking and my lifestyle. He contended that the Spirit of God was a presence in every human being, that there was a spiritual dimension to every person. I'm horrified when you don't see that there is an infinite dimension to a human being, that there is something precious and wonderful in every human being, and that something is divine. Erich Fromm, who was a neo-Freudian, neo-Marxist psychologist, said he had a problem because he was responding to the Holocaust. And he basically said, if the German people had only seen a sacred presence in every person, in every Jew, the Holocaust would have never taken place. That's where I am. I wait.
And that's what you struggle with me, is you're like, you don't have a basis to say everybody's sacred.
I would say, yes, that would be a big problem. I think that you see everything as naturalistic and there's no supernatural dimension to a human being. And I'm contending that with Mother Teresa, that there's a difference between looking at a person and into a person. To be spiritual, to be Christian, isn't just believing in doctrines. It's surrendering and allowing Christ himself to invade you, to become a living presence within you, an energy force in the depths of your being. So that when you look into the eyes of another person, you don't just look at them. Paul writes, before Christ is in you, you look at each other as though through a glass darkly, but then face to face. That face-to-face encounter where I'm able to look into the other person's eyes, and with all the spiritual energy within me, I am able to reach through that person's eyes and down into the depths of that person's being and connect with the innermost recesses of that person's humanity. That spiritual connectedness, for me, requires transcendence. There's something about this human being that is not simply physiological. There is something mystical. There is something spiritual. And I feel myself able to connect with that. Martin Buber, the Hasidic Jewish philosopher, called it an I-thou relationship as opposed to an I-it relationship. The other person is no longer an object, a thing, an it, but you enter into some depth encounter with the other. And I find that Jesus is the one that makes that possible.
I'm curious what your response is to that. Did you want to respond to that? How do you find, where is the source of value for a human that you serve in your work?
You know, I mean, and not to tell you your business, but like,
oh, go ahead. Yeah, I can.
The next question,
I know.
I think is right there.
Right, and the next question is, what frustrates you about your father's or son's position? And you all are spelling that out.
Yeah,
I wasn't even going to say it.
No, yeah, but that's, I mean, because I'm thinking like, I hear this all the time. I get these letters from Christians going like, you know, if you don't believe in God, there's no objective basis for morality. Or, you know, to quote you, Dad, like it's more like, without God, you're going to be incapable of seeing the other person as infinitely precious. And like, I love the poetry of what you just said. Like, it's emotionally moving. But I think to myself, like, if I break the spell for a minute, I go like, how dare you? How dare, like you have no evidence for that. Like, in the world, we see people of many different religious traditions, or none, who the quality of their love for other people, the willingness of them to sacrifice themselves for their children or for children that are not even their children, is the measure of any Christian. Not better, not worse, it's just a human thing. Evolution has hardwired us to care not only about ourselves, but about the other members of our tribe. Like, this is who we are. This is what makes us human. And so the idea that somehow my love for my wife or for my child or for my neighbor is less than or degraded, or I'm not capable of reaching your level without Jesus, it doesn't just, it's a little bit insulting, but it's also like, it makes me smile. Because when I was a Christian and I loved people to the nth degree through the Holy Spirit, and I believed it was the Holy Spirit empowering me, people said, oh, I see God in you. Like, I just feel God working through you. And I'm the same guy. And I love people the same way. And some of the same people that I loved then, David King, I love now. And go ahead and ask David King, can you see any difference? Has the quality of Bart's love for you changed? And so one of the things I deeply disagree with, and that I find hard, is when Christians believe, not that they have a corner on the market, but that they've got, like, some unique quality. You know, you talk about transcendence. You know, secular people are always saying to me, like, the Christians talk about they always say, I bet you're embarrassed that you used to talk about, like, feeling the presence of the Holy Spirit or hearing the voice of God when you were a Christian. I bet you're embarrassed now that you don't believe in any of that stuff. Hey, I don't believe in a supernatural God anymore, but I heard something. And I felt something. And I was on those retreats, and something real happened there. I believe in transcendence. And I always say to my secular friends, if you don't believe in transcendence, you haven't been to the right rock concerts. You haven't used the right drugs. You haven't fallen in love with the right woman or the right man. Transcendence is a human experience, and these experiences that we have, people have them. Who is it? William James would say the quality of religious experience. People have them in all sorts of settings. And so it's important for me to say that to you, because sometimes I think when your kids aren't Christians anymore, you write them off, and you think like you want them to have good lives, and you think they can be good people, but you don't think they can be as good. And you don't think they can love as much, or they can feel as deeply. And I'm here to tell you that I've loved people on both sides of the faith divide, and it's not different.
Go ahead. He's answering a question that is about, is there a compelling secular grounding point for morality?
Well, before we go on,
go ahead.
Dealing with the question of transcendence.
Okay, go for it, yeah. You want to take on transcendence, Tony, please?
Only this. Bart, when you die, is that it? Is that the end of you? Or is there something that is in you that will exist after your body ceases? Yes or no on that one?
My son will live after I'm gone. and I have taught him and loved him and cared for him, and so on some level, I will live on.
Well, okay, if that's what you mean by transcendence.
I'm saying I'm part of something bigger than myself. Transcendence means to be part of something bigger than myself.
Just so we're clear, I'm talking about transcendence differently than you are. It's very, very different.
What are you talking about?
That there is a spiritual dimension that survives the body.
A spiritual, I believe that too. Now, if you say, does my identity, does my Bartness survive? No, I don't think so. But like, do these atoms survive? Does my energy survive? Does my impact on the world survive? I think so. But like, the fact of the matter is, in a few billion years, the sun is going to explode and all of this stuff is going to be swallowed up. And Malone University, I don't care how much the donor gave for the plaque that says, in memorial of, it will be gone.
Except this, that we believe, we Christians, that there's an eternity to each of us. And that if this cosmos should evaporate, we will still be, and we will be with Jesus, and we will be with one another. When you start talking about other people in other places experiencing transcendence,
sure,
my response is, I would not deny that. I think that Jesus is the only way to salvation, but I am not convinced that Jesus only operates within the lives of Christians. I think that Jesus is operating in other people's lives. Billy Graham, just a little story on the side.
Go ahead, yeah.
Billy Graham told me this story. That gives it real legitimacy. Billy Graham said, I went to China to honor my wife, who was a missionary in China with her parents. I was invited to speak at this Buddhist monastery. So I made my way up this path with my aides, and we went into this compound, and as we entered the gate, I looked over to my left, and there was this Buddhist monk in deep meditation. I went over and I sat down with him. I just felt the Spirit of God leading me. I opened the New Testament. I told him all about Jesus. We must have been there for a couple of hours when I explained who Jesus was, who he tried to reach, what he did on the cross, the whole salvation story. And he said at the end, I looked at this Buddhist monk and I said, are you willing to receive him as your personal savior? And he said, the monk looked at me in shock and said, receive him? I would, except that he's already in me. And as you were reading from your scripture, everything you read I agreed with, because his Spirit within me was affirming everything you said. His Spirit, right out of the book of Romans, was bearing witness with my spirit that these things were true. I would accept him, except I already feel his presence. So Billy Graham asked me the very simple question. Was Christ at work in this guy's life before I ever arrived? Was Jesus already in that man? And then he said, and if that's not a hard question to answer, try this one. Suppose he had died before I had arrived. Would he have, in fact, been part of the eternal community of faith?
And as you hear that Billy Graham story, I think that's one of the most important things. And I'm sorry.
No, you're great.
I'm a terrible person.
No, you're not. This is a family Thanksgiving dinner we're at right now.
I know there are some people in this audience that one of the reasons you're here tonight is you're trying to take notes from my dad because you've got somebody in your life that you need to relate to, and it's hard sometimes to relate to people who are on the other side of that divide than you. And I counsel a lot of people that have a lot of struggles in their families on this stuff, and there is one big dividing line. When somebody has that Tony Campolo, Billy Graham theology that you just heard, the notion that God can be at work in people even if they don't know it, or when they have kind of an optimism that perhaps God's capable of saving people in ways that we don't understand.
That's right.
That perhaps God's mercy is wide enough that every knee shall bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord someday. That maybe God's will be done and it's not God's will that any should perish. You say, those are all things that suggest that maybe people who don't believe in God can still be saved. I'm like, you know what? I tell my secular friends, you better learn every Bible verse that suggests that people that don't believe in Jesus can still be saved, because your parents and you are not going to have a good relationship if they remain convinced that you are doomed to suffer eternal damnation because you don't have the right theology. It will be beyond their capability to accept you as you are. And so people say, well, what is it that you've done to have such a great relationship with your parents? And I go, I haven't done anything. My parents did the work. My parents wrapped their head around the idea that perhaps they could trust God with my soul. And that has enabled them to treat me like a human being. And so what I would say is, like, if you don't have at least an openness to the possibility that Jesus might be able to do abundantly more than you could ever hope or pray or expect. You say, gosh, he knows his scripture. Hey, I was in it. If you don't have a theology, you better get one. Because you just saw, like in that story and in the telling of it, you just saw the reason why I can sit in a room and talk with my dad all day long and not feel like I'm getting trampled over. Because he doesn't think I'm going to burn in hell necessarily.
I want to make sure it's an easy job for the moderator tonight. I want to make sure that the audience has an opportunity for questions. So we have about 35 minutes left. And, my questions are what they are, or our questions are what they are. But I'm sure that there's some interesting questions from you all. What I'd ask you to do is, first of all, please ask a question, or I'll just go back to mine. And come up to the mic, ask a question. Please, as I said, don't tell a story. And we'll take them, and you could both answer them. All right, good.
Give us your name.
My name is Travis.
I didn't get it.
Travis. And this question is for Bart. From the people I've known who've left the faith or joined the faith, there's an element of narrative involved. And for the people I know who've left the faith, it was an issue of that narrative dissolving. But I wonder if, in your instance, that there was a case of a secondary narrative forming. Is it the case that atheism offered a narrative, or is it simply that the one you had in Christianity fell apart?
That is a great question. I've never been asked that question. That is a great question. And as soon as you said it, I felt like I know the answer to it. And the reason I know the answer to it is because, remember that conversation I told you I had with my wife when I realized I was done? I realized what had happened for me was I had been doing somersaults for years. And Dad will tell you, I changed my theology 15 times trying to stay a Christian. I mean, I was every kind of heretic before I became apostate. I was a universalist. I was marrying gay people in the name of Jesus. I was doing everything, but I was always trying to rework the scriptures, always trying to rework the narrative to make it possible to stay in. When I was finally done, I realized that I had expended so much energy on trying to make that narrative work that I had no narrative. But I know enough about pursuing goodness, and I know enough about trying to be a good person from Christianity that I knew that I wasn't going to be able to do it unless I had a story. And so, I went to the library and I started getting out books about science, evolution, where we come from. I stumbled around until this buddy of mine from Chicago sent me a book called The Great Agnostic, a biography of Robert G. Ingersoll. Now, none of you have probably ever heard of Robert G. Ingersoll, but if you were alive in 1890, he was the most popular public speaker in world history. Lincoln knew him. Everybody knew him. He was a huge, big deal. And what Ingersoll was he was the son of a preacher who didn't believe in God, but he had come up with a narrative that was based on the idea that if this life is the only one that we have, the only thing we should possibly do is try to figure out how to maximize our pleasure in it, our happiness. But he didn't define happiness as self-indulgence. He defined happiness as becoming fully human. And I gradually put together, and I spent 3 weeks reading all of his stuff. I spent months up there because I knew that I wasn't going to be able to be a good person in the world, and I wasn't going to be able to help anybody else unless not only could I tell people that goodness was a better way of life, but unless I could give them some kind of a story that made sense of it, that begins with the Big Bang and ends with us here, and goodness being the way that what human beings are evolved to do. So no, I didn't have one. Yes, I had to come up with one. Great question. Thank you.
Hi, name's Ashley. So I'd like to hear from both of you on this, if possible. Oh, sorry. Hi. Is that better? Okay. I'd like to hear from both of you on this, if you can. When it comes to having dialogues with each other, and regarding your choice of language, so in that example where you were talking about community, and then on the secular side, they're seduced by the community, do you find using terms that are a little more extreme than what the other person would have come up with to be helpful in showing them a different perspective on the same thing, or do you find it to be more divisive in the conversation?
Do I find that using terms that are more extreme? Did I hear you right?
Is it on? Okay. Just, could I give an example?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so sometimes when people talk about the problem of evil, and they say now, does God, if he doesn't stop it, doesn't that kind of make him a jerk? To someone who's never heard that before put that way, to call him a jerk, or, worse names, is I guess shocking and off-putting enough, at least from what I've seen, that it does more harm than good in the conversation. But when you use terms or concepts that just look at the same thing from a really different angle like that, I'm wondering if you find that to be more helpful in showing them another side.
Okay.
Yeah,
or if it just makes people angry.
What kind of language do you use?
Yeah, so the question is about language use in a healthy dialogue and stronger language use as a way to create bigger differences in the dialogue is about right?
Yeah, or to clarify those differences.
To clarify the differences, yeah. What's your word on healthy dialogue and language?
As much as possible, I think Bart tries to get me to speak with clarity in a way that makes sense to him, and I try to do the same in return. We don't communicate perfectly. Nobody does. But I think we try very, very hard. Language is very important, and what words we use can often be confusing rather than clarifying. And so I thank you for that question. I do want to say this about Bart and a question that you were implying in your earlier question, and it was this. For 10 years, I taught at the University of Pennsylvania, and it was a totally secular Ivy League school. And I had to teach a course because a professor was away and I was low man on the totem pole, and I got stuck with the course on social justice. There were some Muslims. Most of the students were secularists. Few Jewish students. I think there were 2 Christians in the group. And the question that I had to ask as we got the course underway is, could we come up with a unified belief of what is good and what is evil? Can we all agree on what is good and what is evil? I thought this was going to be an impossible task. It took about 5 minutes. Interestingly enough, we all agreed on one thing, and it goes to support Bart's humanism. The conclusion of the group was, whatever enhanced the humanity of a human being was good. Whatever diminished the humanity of another human being was evil. Abraham Maslow was big on the university campus at that time, so we had a very clear idea of what it meant to be human, to be actualized, to be loving, to be fulfilled, to be kind. What is it that enhances the humanity of a person? That's good. Whatever diminishes it is evil. Everybody agreed. Humanists, Christians, everybody agreed. Racism is evil because it diminishes the dignity of other people. Homophobia is evil because it diminishes the dignity of other people. Male chauvinism is evil because it diminishes the dignity of women. I could go on down the list. You get the idea. Vice versa. Everything that enhances the humanity of another person is good. Now, this is where we got to a very interesting evangelistic dimension. How does one take on these traits of being human, kind, empathetic, forgiving, aware? How does one take on these human traits? All these sociology students agreed. We take on these traits by interacting with people who are loving, who are kind, who are forgiving, who are empathetic. We take it on through socialization, through interaction with people who have these traits. And then I ask the obvious question. To become fully human, as Maslow is calling us to be, what would you need to do? And they all said the same thing. Well, you would have to have an ongoing relationship with somebody who was fully human, who was empathetic, who was forgiving, who was loving, who was kind, and the list went on and on and on. I said, do you know anybody like that? And they all agreed, no, we don't. I said, that's the difference between the secularist and the Christian. I do know somebody who is the perfect embodiment not only of God, but he's the perfect manifestation of what it means to be a human being. And you can have, I would say to the class, ongoing relationships with him. He's alive. He's here. He's now. You can have a relationship with him, and that relationship can humanize you and lift you to the highest levels of humanization possible. And Christ is the ultimate humanizing force in the universe. As you know, Bart,
stop.
Several of my secular students were swayed by that to such an extent that they became Christians.
Absolutely. And
have you been swayed by that to the point where you've become a Christian?
many times.
Okay, many times. Okay.
I mean, first of all, I'm going to come back to you in just a sec. The only thing I want to say to that is, as I'm listening to you, I haven't got a negative thing to say. I just realized, how relieved I am to be a secular humanist right now. Because I realized that all the philosophies that I hear my dad talk about, he comes to the students and goes, how would you become perfectly human? As if that's the goal. Or how are we going to have a society where there's no conflict? Heaven, as if that's the goal. And I realized, I stopped believing in utopia years ago. I don't think, you say, Bart, how is your way going to make people into perfect human beings? And I go, it won't. There's no such thing. We can always get better. We can never be perfect. We're coming out of chaos, and chaos is always waiting to swallow us up again. We're struggling against it, and we can do better. But I just realized, wow, it's a heavy bar that you guys have to have because you believe in sort of an ultimate perfection. You, my friend, I have one thing to say to you, and that is that when there are probably some secular people in this room right now, and there often are where I go talk, and I always give them the same advice. I always say, listen, your friends and your family's Christianity, think of it like a language. Think of them like they are loving and kind and good, and you are loving and kind and good. They use Christian language to describe why they're loving and good and what that looks like. It's their language. Now, if you went to France, you would study French. And you would, if you were kind and caring, you would try to speak to people in their own language. You wouldn't try to use language that would be confusing to them. You would try to speak in their language. And I always say, to the extent that it's possible, you want to speak to the people that you love in a language they understand. I always appreciate it when my father says to me at the end of a conversation, I'll pray for you. Or, you know what, he sometimes says, I think you're an anonymous Christian. I think you're a Christian, you just don't know it. He said that to me once in the presence of one of my friends, and my friend said afterwards, "Didn't you feel like he was so demeaning? Didn't you feel that that was so patronizing?" And I said to my friend, "No, you don't understand. In my dad's language, that's the nicest thing he can say about me, is that I remind him of Jesus." And I said, "You have to stop demanding that other people speak to you in your own language, and you need to listen to them in theirs." And I'll tell you that one of the times when I feel the most loved by my dad or by any Christian person is when they say, "You know, Bart, I was reading this book by this fellow Sam Harris, and he suggests this idea. Is that what you think?" And I go like, "Oh, you're trying to talk to me in my language. You're trying to understand where I'm coming from." And so it really is, we're living in two different worlds. And if we're going to have really close relationships, we've got to be willing to listen to the other person in their language. And you have to be willing to assume that when somebody says something that offends you, you know, have you ever had that happen, like where a Spanish person says, like, you know, or somebody from another country says, like, "Your nose is very ugly," and you realize, like, they don't know what they're saying. What they meant to say was, "Thank you for the salami," and so you have to learn to be forgiving. That many times when a person says something incendiary, or when they say something about you that really hurts you, it's not that they're really aiming to hurt you. It's that they don't know how to speak your language.
I have to say that your question is pointed, and the reality is that there are things that we cannot share because I do believe in dimensions of existence that are transcending the physical. I do believe in the spiritual. In the words of Blaise Pascal, "The heart has reasons which reason can never know." And you're such a rationalist now. And if somebody says, "Does your father insult you?" I don't mean to insult you. I don't mean to diminish you. But I do have to say that there comes a point where I'm not as open as I would like to be. I often say to my students, the most open thing in the world is a garbage can. It'll accept anything that's thrown its way. And I'm afraid I'm not open to everything. There are places where I do draw the line. So I do want to affirm that there is a difference in language at some point. There are a lot of places where our languages are the same. Many places where we are in total agreement. And as I was talking about what it means to become human, I'm sure you could resonate to that up to a point. It's when I went one step further and said, here's Jesus. He's not only the incarnation of God, but he is the incarnation of what it means to be an actualized, complete, and full human being. And that's the relationship that I want to invite people into, this transformative relationship with Jesus.
Yeah, you know, it's funny. The more I think about it, I don't think I'm as rational, because I don't think human beings are like we're rationalizing. Like we have gut feelings about things, and then we make up reasons, we make up stories for why we think them, but we really think them because I just feel that way. But I think increasingly I'm an evidist, like I'm an evidence person, where when somebody says to me, this is the way things are, I say, like, why do you believe that? And I'm looking for some kind of evidence for it. And there's a lot of things that when my Christian friends say to me, this is what I believe, and I say, like, but why do you believe that? And they say, like, it's just a matter of faith. And, that's the last. Can I say one?
I'd like to turn back to the question. Say one more thing if you'd like to, but I'd like to turn back to the question.
I just want, if anyone, I don't see any.
There's one person.
Oh, good. Okay,
here, yeah.
Then I'll shut up. The only thing I was going to say is this: is that there's another beautiful thing, and that is this: is that a lot of times my Aunt Rose is one of my heroes. My Aunt Rose is this very old woman who is just so full of faith, and she was heartbroken when she found out about me, and she wrote me a letter, and she said, Bart, I am not going to talk to you about this. I'm going to talk to Jesus about you. She said, because the Bible says that we're saved by grace through faith, and this not of yourself, lest any man should boast. It is a gift of God. And she said, you know what? I'm not gonna talk to you about what's wrong with you because you don't have faith. I believe that God gives faith to people, and I'm going to ask God to give you more faith. And I think it's a beautiful thing to do for your secular friends, is instead of haranguing them for not having faith, pray to the one who gives faith.
Let him ask the question.
Yeah, who's next
Who's got a
here,
question?
Tony? Thank you.
Wow. First of all, before I ask this, I want to thank Tony, because as Bart so beautifully put, and I mean this in the nicest way possible, I think that your version of Jesus, from when I was a kid, has inspired most of my political fights recently, because of social justice. But I worked for the Purple Door Festival. I was the director, and Bart, you spoke for us for a couple of years and did an amazing job. And I really identify with what you're talking about constantly trying to reinvent my faith to make it fit for the evidence as I see, and struggle with it from time to time, but not in a way but with the sense that there's something to it. And it's really interesting because in the course of this week, I just keep accidentally, in the midst of my really busy day, running into these things where the Gungor coming out, the Mrs. Gungor coming out with her confession of leaving the church and atheism.
I'm sorry, we're having trouble hearing you up here.
Okay.
Could you ask us the question so we can hear it?
Okay, can you hear me now?
It's just hard to hear up here. I'm sorry.
This auditorium stinks.
Yeah, it's hard to hear up here.
Very pretty, though.
Yeah, okay. So now I'm bass guy. Okay. No, I've just been running into people over and over for the past couple of days where I am running into different encounters of strong people of faith leaving the faith. And I'm identifying with a lot of their stories, very much so. And I'm very much identifying with what you're talking about with trying to fit in. But at the very core of my identity, I also look at these coincidences that keep making me encounter this.
And you see providence there.
And it seems like there's providence
Miracles, yeah.
there. And I'm just wondering, in the very core of my identity, I feel like God is leading me to come here and check out atheism.
So,
how messed up does that make me right now?
So the question's about how Bart relates to the question of providence in his daily life. The other question I would have along that regard is your experience as an evangelical in your life growing up. You develop like an informal prayer relationship with God among other habits, right, of an evangelical.
Absolutely.
Like, do you find yourself praying still? Do you find yourself noticing moments of providence in your life and going like, oh, don't think that, I'm secular now, this kind of thing?
Yeah, no, I get asked all the time, like, don't you? Yeah. I mean, I think that the first thing I would say is that my experience, I was an inner city missionary for 25 years. And so, people say, like, what happened to your faith? Well, sometimes I say it died the death of 1,000 cuts. It might be more fair to say it died the death of 1,000 unanswered prayers. You'd have some kid that was getting beaten up at home. I mean, I wasn't asking God for a Ferrari. I wasn't asking him to win the lottery. I was just asking him to stop. Could you protect this kid from getting beaten up at home? And kid kept getting beaten up at home. Little girls got raped in my neighborhood. People died. Like, there was no sense to the whole thing. Like, and you say, well, but didn't sometimes God answer prayer? And the answer was, yeah. Yeah. My experience with prayer was that God answered prayers precisely as often as those prayers would have been answered by blind chance. You go, like, do people get miraculously healed of cancer? In my experience, once in a while. But like, we prayed for lots of people, and most of them died. And so, like, my personal experience with prayer wasn't like, that wasn't the hard. You say, do you still find yourself praying? I stopped praying, like Dad was saying. I stopped praying 5 years before I gave up Christianity because it didn't work. I mean, I changed my theology to one in which I believed that God wasn't able to answer my prayers. That God was constrained somehow because, like, I wanted to keep liking him and he just kept not showing up. And so for me, the occasional miracle, like somebody won the lottery today. They won $1.6 billion. I'm sure from their perspective it's a miracle. But the reality is it's a mathematical thing. It happens.
I'm curious what Tony has to say about prayer and those kind of things in response here. I know that you have ideas about that too. We're running out of time.
Yeah, sure.
I don't understand prayer. I do know this, that I read a book by Laubach entitled Prayer, the Most Powerful Force in the World. Sometimes I try to reach Bart through God. I pray for Bart. God, touch my son. God, send your Spirit to speak to his heart. God, send the Holy Spirit to convince him in ways that I can't. That's one way of praying. There's another way of praying in which God is trying to get to my son through me. It's one thing to try to say, God, you reach my son, and God's saying, Tony, you reach Bart. In other words, the power of the Spirit flows into me and then can flow through me to another person. I have this mystical awareness that I am able to impact other people as God flows through me and out of me to the other individual. I become a lens through which the Spirit of God is focused on another person, and thus prayer can impact people. Now, the place where I see this most...
So it changes you, and then yes. God uses you to change the person.
Let me say this. As a preacher, there are times when I'm preaching and I feel the Spirit of God flowing through me to the people in the congregation. And I feel God connecting with them through me, that I have become an instrument through which the love of God is flowing to the people who are in the congregation. Yeah. So it's one thing to go through God to the person. It's another thing for God to come through me to the person. And that's a side of prayer that I do understand.
And that's the way I still pray.
Yeah.
I still pray that way.
Yeah.
I don't believe in the God, but like the idea of seeing a friend of mine who's having a very hard time and going like, each day I'm going to stop and I'm going to think about that person and I'm going to make myself available and I'm going to ask the question, is there any way I can be used to encourage and help that person?
Prayer kind of comes in. Prayer in that sense comes across as a kind of mental telepathy.
No, you know? I just think it's making yourself available.
Yeah. Let me say, because we don't want to go on and on.
We do want to go on and on.
We have one
they
more
don't
question.
want
Can I have another question? Yeah, do you mind? Oh, you wrote it down. Bless you.
Well,
Wonderful.
I was making notes. When I first thought I would come up here, I had one question, but since I've been sitting here, I came up with three more.
One, please. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll try to just put it together. So, you know, Bart, when you were talking about faith and how, you know, if you just have enough faith, and, you know, I grew up in a Christian home, and I've heard that, you know, my whole life. And there's times when you pray and you just wonder, you know, where is God, or why isn't this, you know, changing or whatever. But, you know, were you here when the Big Bang happened?
No.
So does that require faith?
I think on some level it does. Yeah, I think that to put your faith in science, like, you know, I get in my car every day. I have no idea how it works. Yeah. Other people figured it out for me. So yeah, I think there is a leap of. I think like a good philosopher would say that even to believe that other people, that the world exists outside, like that reality exists, is on some level a leap of faith.
So for anything that you're going to believe, you have to have faith.
Yeah, you do.
That well. And so that goes into the prayer part of it, where, you know, your prayers just didn't get answered. And then I'm sure you know the story of Joseph in the Bible when he's sold by his brothers and then the gypsies, and then he ends up in Potiphar's house, and then he's able to provide for his brothers. So yeah, it was a long time that he had to wait for an answer to that prayer.
He's trying to save me.
But
I know.
I would suggest, and I don't know if you would agree with this or not, but there was an answer to prayer, but it was in God's timing. What would you say to that?
Thank you.
I just want to say this. Dan Rather was interviewing Mother Teresa. When you pray, what do you say to God? She said, I don't say anything, I listen. So Dan Rather said, well, when you pray, what does God say to you? She said, God doesn't say anything, God listens. And then she paused and said, if you don't understand that, I can't explain it to you. And that has great profundity to it. There is a kind of praying where there are no words going up, there are no words coming down. You just feel yourself in fellowship, you feel yourself connected, you feel yourself surrendered to God. And I do want to say that. I do want to say one thing more, because I think we really need to wrap this thing up.
We are about to wrap it up.
Yeah.
Can I just ask my main question, my first one that
I'm sorry. We've already had a couple questions from you. I'm sorry. Yeah. I have to move it forward.
Well, I just wanted to say this in closing, that big in my consciousness is Jesus. Jesus overwhelms me. A group of young people got together with Jim Wallace and Ron Sider and myself, and we were the elders. We call ourselves the elders. And they said we can't use the word evangelical anymore. The word evangelical has too much political baggage. It means that you identify with Donald Trump. Well, there's nothing wrong with that, I guess. But Jesus is neither a Republican nor a Democrat. And we cannot reduce God to a political party or to a particular individual. They said when the word evangelical is used, we get this image of anti-gay, anti-women, anti-environmentalist, anti-immigrant. We get these negative things, and that's not who we are. So they came up with a new name. They started calling themselves Red Letter Christians. The movement has spread around the world. Everywhere I go now, I find people who say, we're not going to call ourselves evangelicals anymore. We're still orthodox in our theology. We believe in the doctrines of the Apostles' Creed. We believe the Bible was inspired by the Holy Spirit and that the writers that wrote it were guided by the Spirit in what they wrote. We believe in having a personal relationship with the resurrected Jesus. We just don't want to call ourselves evangelicals because the press, and I blame the press for this, the press has given it a meaning. So, I hope that some of you want to become Red Letter Christians. Go to the website, check it out, redletterchristians.org. I happen to have brought along wristbands. I wear one. They cost me 60 cents a piece. But because I love you, you can have one. I got a bag of them here. And I'll sell them to you, but because I love you, I'll sell them to you for $1 a piece. The profit will go to the Red Letter Christian movement. I would like for you, whether you're a humanist or whether you're a Christian, to look at Jesus and say, that's what I want to be. That's what I want to become. And my difference is that Jesus is here and now, and he will help you to become like him. Brothers and sisters, says the Scriptures, it hath not yet appeared what we shall be, but one day we shall be like him when we see him face to face. So become a Red Letter Christian, give me $1 and I'll give you a wristband. Thanks. That's my wrap up for tonight. Bart, do you want to wrap up?
I don't have anything to sell. I want to say one thing. And what I want to say is thank you. Thank you for coming tonight and for sitting through us and for clearly being the kind of people that are eager to figure out what it means to love people who think differently than you. In our country right now, I watched those Kavanaugh hearings. And what amazed me about those Kavanaugh hearings was day after day, seeing something happen in real time and watching then two groups of people who saw it completely differently. That was what was striking, right? Is that they saw the same evidence and yet because of who they were and where they were coming from, they saw it differently. That's a lot how this conversation sometimes is. And I think it's really important to recognize that the people who think differently than you may not be as different than you as you think. And I'm just so grateful to you for wanting to figure out and wanting to think and feel a little bit what happens when people who think differently talk to each other in a loving way. I hope you've picked up the love and the respect and the care and the joint commitment to making the world a more humane place, whether that leads us to Jesus or it just leads us to a more humane world. And so I thank you for being part of, you may be red letter Christians, but I can tell that all of you are part of a larger movement, even than that are just people that are really trying to figure out what the truth is, and people that are really trying to figure out what it means to be loving, and want to just do that, because that's what's in your hearts. And it is a joy to be with you. So thank you so much for having us here today.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for all coming out. Would you please join me in giving both of our speakers a round of applause?
We'll be here if you want to come up and talk to us.
Absolutely, and you have a table in the back with some literature too, if you'd like to visit there. Welcome to the campus if you're new to campus. Also, this is the point of Worldview Forum: critical engagement, critical thinking, and the exploration of people's worldviews. And so I really thank you all for coming tonight.
Thanks, man.
Thanks, appreciate it.
This place.